All right, good afternoon and hello everyone. Welcome to DataCon LA 2022. My name is Charlie. I will be your host for this session. Please be mindful for COVID regulations. Keep your mask on whenever possible. Also, silence your phone during the session. Please do not hesitate to raise your hand if you have any questions. The session is currently streaming via Zoom and will be recorded. It will also be available online in a few weeks. Today, for our panel, which is about coming to terms with data privacy laws, we have our moderator, Jeanne Holm, Deputy Mayor at the City of Los Angeles, our panelists, Martin Devon, VP Digital Transformation at Autonomous Health, and Parker Lowrey, SVP of Data at WIT Media today. So without further ado, let me hand this over to them.
Great, thank you, and welcome to all of our viewers online and everybody participating here in the room at DataCon LA and the combination with RMDS this year with IM Data. And a big thank you to USC for hosting this event this year and for all of you who are helping out with it and who will be watching online and our recordings as well. My name is Jeanne Holm. I'm the Deputy Mayor for Budget and Innovation at the City of Los Angeles. So for those of you here who aren't native to Los Angeles, welcome to the city on behalf of Mayor Eric Garcetti. Today we're going to talk about a variety of things related to data privacy, data security, and some emergent ideas around data ethics and kind of all of our responsibilities, all of you who are data scientists, data consumers, data users, technologists, managers, kind of what kind of responsibilities do we have or don't we have in making sure that data stays secure and private and is used in the way that people who share it intend for it to be used. So I'm going to ask our speakers to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how data privacy affects their work. So first we'll start with Martin.
Hi, thank you so much, Jeanne. So as Jeanne said, my name is Martin Devon. I started out in the data world in the entertainment business. I first started on data architecture, digitizing music products. So back before you had all the wonderful tools we have, back in the old days, you used to listen to music on records or CDs, cassette tapes. For someone in my era, you'd make, if you wanted to ask someone out, you'd make a mixtape for them. I'm dating myself. But back then I started first thinking about data when you think about what it is you want to describe when you're talking about a musical composition and what's important to capture, and then how to take a look at digital rights and that kind of thing. And after a long time in the entertainment business, I moved to healthcare and had a lot of experience around, I was running a big nonprofit health information exchange where I had to help different healthcare entities negotiate how they could exchange patient information. And so I got a deep dive and a deep education into what you need to do to make sure that the data is private. It's very complicated when it comes to healthcare. We want to make sure that everything about our own healthcare is kept private, but we need to share information with a variety of, doctors or, different healthcare organizations in order to make sure to take care of you. So those are very complicated questions. So that's where I got a chance to learn about that.
Hi, I'm Parker. Just an SVP, or as of a week ago, was SVP of data at WIT Media. And yeah, so how have we gotten into data privacy? Well, and how has it affected my work? So I've worked for a couple companies now building data products, and I mean, at the end of the day, like, what's this saying? So if you're not paying for it, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product, right? So ultimately, companies have to be able to make money and they want to offer these services. So I work for companies that try to repackage consumer data like in various forms. So for example, a marketing analytics firm called Sense360, they would use location data to be able to determine like foot traffic to brick and mortar stores, right? And we will go into a lot of this, I'm sure, but like the sensitivity around there. And in the early days with smartphones, there wasn't a lot of protections. I mean, like, they've gotten a lot better about it, but there really wasn't. So you could just like get full access to all of this information, and it was really crazy. So now I think people are realizing that it's a real thing. But my background though is, I got my doctorate in math in 2010, and I went to academic route, and then came out on the other side of academia wanting to build data products. So that's what I do now.
Right. And then there's a lot of pressing issues, I think, for data privacy in the fields that we're representing, the fields we've worked in, which everybody's got kind of a large background. I know that in government, for example, some of the things we're concerned about is being open and transparent. So before I came to the city, I was the architect for data.gov for the Obama administration. And we really worked with 175 different agencies at the federal level to open up data, then to open it up in ways that were actually usable, then to open it up in machine readable ways. It was like a learning journey in those early days of open data in 2008, 2009, to see what kind of data people wanted, but also what kind of data was useful and what formats it would be useful. And I just had an interesting conversation earlier this week about the data on data.gov not being able to be used and consumed as training data sets for machine learning, because that's a kind of particular structure. So I think, we're looking at these issues where there's pushes to share data, whether that's an internal push, because there's, as you say, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. There might be an internal push to, make revenue off this data, to improve services off this data, or in government trying to be transparent and sharing the data so that other people can use that in different effective ways. But it's also a challenge because there's this other side of what data should we protect, or what data are people expecting us to protect, and how do our data sharing agreements with other companies affect that? So some of the pressing issues for this data privacy and security in your field, Martin, maybe you want to just start us off thinking, like, what are the urgent issues that people are struggling with?
Well, I think there's so many different places you could go here. Interestingly, one of the great things about DataCon is in the green room, before you come on your panel, you meet some of the other people who are giving lectures or panels. And we've got an interesting discussion about how do you give consent to your data, and how do you give consent to using something. So, you buy a new iPhone, or you download the new version, and they say, do you agree to our data agreement? And you could scroll through. If you're a lawyer, maybe you might enjoy going through the 15 pages of this, but if you've bought the iPhone, you're going to say yes, right? So what does it really mean to agree to use are you going to opt out of life? What does it really mean to consent? And similarly around data, around healthcare particularly, you have to really think about what does it mean to consent. So one of the things near and dear to my heart is consenting to share your medical data with other professionals. So when you're going to the doctor nowadays, your doctor will ask you to sign, okay, do you agree to share your data or don't you? And one of the things we got to get better about is in our agreements, summarizing what are you agreeing to. So you could have an agreement where you're agreeing to share your data in life and death situations, or when you're referred to another doctor. But some of those agreements will allow, let's say if a doctor has an agreement where he'll share the information, he or she will share the information with pharmaceutical companies, at least you want to know about that if you're consenting to it. So we got to get better about raising the issues people care about, and not giving them a 20-page agreement they wouldn't understand, even if they read it.
Do you think that companies are, to a certain extent, intentionally making it difficult for people to understand, so we all just for convenience say yes, accept the terms?
I think some of them are, but to be fair, a lot of them want to make sure that they're covered in cases of, they don't want to be sued. So their lawyer gives them back, and they say, well, this is what you need to do in order to be covered. Okay. And it's so common in life. But I do think there are some people that don't necessarily have your best interest at heart. And that's where having standard agreements, and I think there's a role for government where they make sure that, okay, we surface these kinds of issues.
Parker, you've worked in a variety of fields and kind of looked at this overall as well. So what do you think about these urgent issues, maybe in entertainment as well, data privacy issues? We had this conversation earlier about gaming and what you share over your gaming space too.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it comes down to, okay, so part of what I also do in my job is augment data sets, right? Because, and I don't think everyone understands how much data is being collected on them by all the applications that they don't even necessarily think that they're collecting data. Like you could download an antivirus program and then I could buy the data set about what you watched, right? Like, and you wouldn't even know it because maybe you didn't read the full agreement where it says like, we have the right to observe your screen and things like that. So like, I think wrapping our heads around the amount of data that's being collected on us by all these applications is really difficult, but then also the tenure of like, it's not like it just goes away, right? As long as someone's willing to pay to store it, means that things that you did 15 years ago could be brought up. Like, let's say maybe you're running for political office and someone wanted to buy data sets about you and like they could uncover stuff from 15 years ago. You're like, wait, that was like, what is going on here, right? So like, there's no, like, your history does not disappear anymore. And I think that's a big thing, like about all the collection of data. And so, yeah, so ultimately, we're just gonna have to get, I don't know if there is a non-government way of doing this, but like ultimately, how do you wrap your head around like, what's your data, right? Like you can't go to any single place and go, here's all the data that's collected on, right? So you don't even know, like microprocessors, like, yeah, the amount of the different things that collect data is just crazy. So I think that's a big issue, like even understanding and like making that maybe straightforward. And then also, like I think everyone has the right to be like forgetting their past, right? And so how do you enact that when like everything's recorded forever?
Right. So I think that kind of leads into this idea of companies getting acquired by other companies, especially in tech. So like that's the big goal for small companies, is to get bought out by a bigger company for $1 billion or more. And so I think that's part of the challenge, is that you may trust a company that you share data with, maybe like a lot of data. So if you have a rare disease, there's a lot of medical companies that we talked about that may give you very valuable information, and you may be totally comfortable, for whatever reason, sharing that because what you get in exchange is helpful. But then that company gets bought by a big conglomerate, who gets bought by another big conglomerate, and you've lost control of your data, because generally, for some companies, the acquisition is the acquisition of the data. The data is one of the major economic assets. So when we think about this kind of transfer of trust, it's one thing when you say, I'm introducing two people and now, oh, okay, Parker, you're friends with Martin. I'll trust that Martin's a nice guy because I like you. But when we get to the point of these companies acquiring each other, like how do we help people be aware of that? Whether you're a technologist in the company to kind of speak up about it, or whether you're a person who's using one of these companies that gets acquired. How do we help people be aware?
That's a really good question. One of the things that I've seen in healthcare is when people agree to partner with a new healthcare company, they put in a clause to say that's until you're acquired. If you're acquired, we reserve the right to claw back the information, because people have been burned in healthcare, and they've been burned in entertainment and every other. Even before you had the data problem, you had some of the big companies that in the tech space. I don't know if anyone remembers CA as a big company, right? And there were places that they would buy whatever product CA didn't offer, because they didn't like CA's terms. And then CA would buy the company that they had, and that was I guess I shouldn't name names, but I think it's been long enough ago, it's not an issue.
Yeah, that's Parker?
Well, there's one more thing I want to revisit back from your prior question, actually. And the other one is that, especially like in entertainment, data introduces biases, right? And feedback loops. So like, let's say, one of my teams, we need to be able to predict how a piece of content is going to do and which audiences it would attach to, right? And so if you think about, like, say, a recommendation engine, and you watched a couple shows, right? And it's going to produce this feedback loop, more or less, that's going to start serving you up more and more of the shows. So like, you're kind of typecast very early on when you actually when you interact with any data that's using machine learning, unless they're really, unless the data scientists and the product managers have really tried to break out of that mold. Like some do, some are like really thinking about this, but some are just like, let's just throw up a recommendation engine and call it a day, right? And you get this feedback loop where it's just like, oh, you clicked on like, a CNN article about Hillary Clinton now, where it's going to feed you all of this like very left-wing type of stuff, or the opposite, right? And so it's just kind of, yeah, it's part of what's creating some of the, I think, tension in our society too, right? It's like the use of our data against us is like, we always want to think that data is good, more information is good, but it's like kind of being weaponized right now.
For those kind of products, I remember like I went through a Grace Kelly kick where I just want to see every one of her movies. She's not necessarily a favorite actress, but I just found, or there's just a series, and I just went for a deep dive for a month. Am I stuck with it for life?
Depends on how big the data science team is, on whether they could take into account time frames, and but most of the time, let's say that again, like if that's looked at as just a feature to try to keep you in the app, but not like a core offering, then yeah, they'll just throw up a recommendation engine that they trained over the course of 2 weeks and integrate it and be done.
And I think in addition to things like recommendation engines, we also have to think about bias, particularly as we're moving to artificial intelligence and machine learning. So for example, we just put every employee at the City of Los Angeles through implicit bias training, every single one of our 56,000 employees. And we felt that that was important. Again, it wasn't telling them what they should do. It was just making people aware of their own biases. So I love animals, I truly do. But to be honest, I prefer dogs to cats. And so that may not seem like a big deal, but I'm in charge of the city's budget, and I fund animal services, which funds and cares for cats and dogs. So it's helpful for me to be aware of the fact that I have this bias, so that when I'm looking at trade-offs, I can make that trade-off. Now, that's a trivial example. Again, I love cats and dogs. But when we're talking about things like trying to select people for our guaranteed basic income program, where 3,200 families are getting $1,000 a month for a year to help them during COVID. If we put implicit bias, if we let implicit bias happen in the algorithm, but that we help to make selections there, suddenly we're actually really making serious choices and affecting people. And so how do we start, like for the people here who are technologists and developers and kind of working in the field, how should we help them be aware to be and empower them to sort of call things out, or to be aware even when they might be introducing bias?
So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult. It's almost like you're creating software and you have a user manual almost, right? Like, because ultimately any data set you use is going to be biased in some particular way, right? Like this is impossible to get ground truth. No matter how hard you try, there's always like some sort of effect that's introducing bias into the data. So some you're going to be aware of, some you're not. You should definitely, I would say, good data teams will try to understand what their biases are, and just like any good data governance program, what comes out of the machine learning algorithm is again data, right? And so, you should always be making sure that the output to the algorithm matches the context where it's being consumed, right? And it takes lots of documentation. It takes lots of overhead to do these things, right? And so when you're talking about startups or budget constraint, budget's always constrained across many areas of life. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to do that due diligence. I'm pretty sure it's not happening very often.
I saw a panel this morning at DataCon that kind of gives me a different twist on this question. The discussion was about audio description, and it was also around, for people who are not sighted, how can you accommodate them? Like if you've got these graphs, and when you look at a graph, you might be looking at trend information. So they were talking about adding trend information when you talk about graphs, or when you've got healthcare graphs. So they include context. If you've seen, you do a blood test and you get particular score on cholesterol. Telling you that you've got a 300 on cholesterol, is that good? Is that bad? So they put it within a band and they go, low is here, you're within the safe band. If you're above or below, and these are ramifications. So you could explain that in accessibility. But other graphs, particularly around stocks, or there's deep intuitive patterns that we're recognizing. And one of the things that we had talked about is, from a data perspective, separating out what you're presenting with what patterns you're recognizing. So if you are not a sighted person, you still have pattern recognition, you just don't do it visually. So could you use sound? Could you, like, as a data scientist, can you think about, okay, what am I presenting, and can you filter out what are the patterns, and is there another way I could represent the pattern? So apropos to the question we just asked, can we filter out, okay, looking from a data perspective, where is the bias in the data, and can we pull that out, or at least give it context? What do you think?
I think that's a great perspective, and I think the issue around accessibility is so important. You know, we have aging populations, but we also have, like in Los Angeles, 220 languages are spoken. So even when we think of just about like linguistic accessibility, it's important. And Google Translate, God bless them, doesn't do everything. And it really struggles with things like graphs. So I think that's part of it. I also think that part of what the path to success is hiring diverse teams. So, you know, if there's a whole bunch of people who kind of look the same age, same background, they may really gel and kind of be very productive, but they're going to have, like, they may have very shared biases. And so having teams of developers, bringing in interns with different perspectives, you know, bringing in, and then doing testing with diverse groups of people so that you don't run into the issues with Facebook, famously, who, you know, created machine learning and computer vision that couldn't identify people of color because it had only been trained on 20-year-old white guys. And so I think you have to kind of say, I'm going to build in the kind of people and who are going to help hold us accountable for doing something good or something truthful, and then also testing it and opening it up so that people can give us feedback and be open to that feedback to make it better.
I have a good story about that, actually, regarding privacy. So early on, it was let's say, I think only about 4 or 5 of us at maybe 6 at Since 360, and you know, all of us were well-intentioned, right? And you know, so we have all this data that we could determine like where all of these phones were going, right? And to us, that wasn't really a big deal. It was like, okay, you know, we're trying to build this data product out of this that's going to be anonymized, and that information will only leak out. It's fine. But then, you know, after looking at it for a year, like, oh, I bet as we grow, it probably would not be great for everyone in the company to have access to like all of like everywhere where someone went, right? Like knowing that they went to church, knowing they went where their like kids go to school, like all these things, right? So we then had to go and explicitly build in all of these like separation of private zones and kind of like only key individuals could get access to underlying data, but it took a lot of effort, right? And ultimately paid off in the product, which is good, because like companies also don't want to know this, right? That's like, you know, but you know, it's just like being a small team of people who are all kind of just like not concerned about it because it's never been an issue for us. It just, you know, breeds into this thing. There's like these biases where it's like in these danger zones that could actually be exploited at some point.
I think it's important to also note that there's a linguistic difference between bias and intent. So you can be biased because of your background, your exposure, your experiences. Your intention can still be good, right? As long as you're aware of those biases, or those biases don't affect the outcomes in an unintended way of what you're doing. Intention is something different. So when we say that people have a bias, I just want to make sure people understand, we don't mean that they're bad or that having a bias is bad. Being unaware of a bias that negatively affects what you're doing, that's something that we want to try to help people avoid.
I think your point around linguistic bias is also really interesting. So my wife is Mexican, and so when we met at Tony Robbins, and I only spoke English and she only spoke Spanish. And so as we were dating, we got to learn how to talk to one another. And it's really interesting. You get into somebody else, you see from a different language, like why she thinks the way she does, why I think the way I do. And you start to learn, like, even in English, we have linguistic biases, but when you start to learn another language, you start to see a lot of things that it was invisible before. So I think that's the point you were making about these different teams, is that when you start to work with people that they have different biases, the bias isn't bad, it's just that's how they grew up, that's where they come from. The intention is learning what's going on with your biases and how it produces results.
Right. We did a project at the city of LA called Shake Alert. So it was the first earthquake early warning system in the country. And so so this was a mobile app. And in order to do this, we had to know a couple of things. One, we had to know an earthquake was coming. So we worked with um, the U.S. government that has earthquake sensors all over the country. And they can detect the ground shaking before you'll feel the shaking. So we were talking about nanosecond delivery of warnings so that you would know that within the next 60 seconds you would feel an earthquake and how strong it was going to be. But obviously, LA is a big place, right? And we actually gave alerts all over Southern California because we didn't have to kind of geofence it specifically. And so it's going to be very different if you're in Lancaster or Ventura than if you're in San Diego. So we wanted to deliver information specific to where you were or approximately where you were. So we said, well, within sort of 10 square miles, it should be relatively about the same amount of shaking. So we had to know that where your phone location was within 10 square miles periodically. That was, you wouldn't believe, that's all we needed to know. And we rolled it out and we had 1 million users. We eventually rolled it up to the state. But it was amazing what people thought we were trying to collect about them and what they thought we were trying to do with that data when literally, to be honest, they didn't want to know anything about you except your location in proximity to the earthquake. So sometimes we have the other thing where people assume sort of the worst because, you know, trusting government is low or trusting a specific organization might be low, and then you have this other outcome.
What's funny actually is that, okay, so you cannot go back in time and record data, right? So you get in this mindset anytime you're setting up like metrics and recording data that you want to record everything that you can, right? Because you don't know if it's going to be useful. Maybe you'll make use of it, and then someday, like, you know, you don't when like you want that there so when you can use it, right? But that's counter to what you're talking about here, which is like, okay, on the other hand, if you really want to not get in trouble or make your life easier with GD, like all the different privacy laws, you should only record things that you absolutely need to, right? Like you may actually be able to get someone's like, you know, gender and their and their age, but if you're really not like, if it doesn't make sense, you shouldn't, right? And like, so there's this kind of like this like juxtaposition or like these like opposing kind of forces that happen when anytime people are creating apps or like anything that records stuff, because they want to like, especially if they're like creating a data product. So I think things are going towards what you're talking about there, where it's like, let's just, what's the minimum we need to be able to do it? But like, I think we're still very far from that overall mindset across all of developers.
I expect that in healthcare, kind of that what you were just talking about, Parker, wanting to collect everything. I don't know about you, but when I go to one of my doctor's offices, I swear I fill out the same 20 forms over and over and over again. And even though they've gotten better about electronic health records, it's like you already know the medications I'm on. Like you already know how old I am. You already know, you know, the basic demographic data. Is healthcare one of those areas where you think that people are more willing to share because they get a potentially better benefit, or that we just gather data randomly to be able to give the doctor sort of peripheral information?
When you ask that question, like my brain floods, like I want to explain, no, the reason they're doing this is because, so if I think back to my nonprofit days, and you look at, for example, if you've got underserved population that is going to a clinic. So unfortunately, the way a lot of the clinics are funded is they've got, you know, they get all these different individual grants. And there's one particular clinic that I went to that we were trying to help them share the information with the bigger hospitals. And so what happened is they had this computer over here that was associated with this grant and this application. And this one over here, it wasn't even like a different application on the same computer. It was a different computer. Like they have like 5 different screens, and depending what they're talking about, they go to the different ones. And because of grant reasons and different reasons, they couldn't talk to each other, right? So sometimes the reason they're asking is, well, you just came here last Tuesday. You know, I was here last Tuesday. You asked me the same questions. Yeah, that went into that computer. But those questions going, you're not going to explain that to anybody. You're just say, I'm so sorry. It's just the way we do that. Can you please, you know, and that's. Yeah.
For your thing about like, should they be collecting it? I mean, if you don't have strong laws, especially on healthcare, that help like not using that to affect other aspects of your life, then yeah, you shouldn't, right? Because, for example, let's say that you regularly go and they take your cholesterol, right? And maybe for various health reasons, your cholesterol spikes and maybe comes back down. Like, I mean, if you apply for a life insurance application, like that's now in your record and it's going to affect your rates, right? So like, yeah, I mean, I think that's just like a minor example of what could come once we start recording more and more data. And like, yeah, there's got to be strong laws for this.
Well, think about how many applications ask for your social security number. You absolutely, positively should not ask, if you're building an application, unless there's a specific reason to do that and a really important reason. That's the reason why there's so much fraud, is because people were able to get that information off of so many people from, and I'll be out in the world and someone will say, well, we need to know your social security number. And I'm like, no, you don't. And they're like, well, that's our process. I'm sorry. And I'm like, no, and I'll complain about it, right? But it's that kind of thing, that where to buy a car, you should not have to give your social security number.
Right. As every good database developer knows, you won't need a unique ID for each participant in a study or each individual instance. And what better unique ID than a social security number? Because, right, everybody's got a unique ID.
Turns out that's not true, but that's a story for a different day.
Well, and the thing is then when you're working with people who don't have social security numbers because they're not either, for whatever reason they haven't gotten it, or they're not resident in the United States, or then suddenly it becomes a problem and a challenge. So Parker, you've mentioned a couple of times things around the right to be forgotten and the GDPR. So just to kind of spin everybody up, in Europe, there's a much different kind of set of policies around data privacy and security, which ends up affecting things in the US as well. But those laws are the idea that you have a right to be forgotten. So if something happened to you in the past, or you did something in the past and that is now, it was either somebody like saying something nefarious about you, or maybe you serve time and you've done that and you're done with it, that there's a ability to apply to expunge some records. And then there's different kind of privacy laws, which is why we have so many cookie acceptances on so many websites these days. It's actually trying to give you more control over the data that you share. So Parker, you want to talk a little bit about kind of some of these allusions you've been making?
Being explicit, or yeah, so I mean, I guess let's start with just like maybe let's just start with the standpoint of like, as a developer, right? You can make your life easier and not, when it comes to GDPR, right? And like, there's a couple of simple things you should do, like we've already talked about, which is like not record data if you if you don't need it, right? Second one would be like separation of like things that are personal away from things that like maybe you want to use in your application, so that, and like, making a weak connection so that you could easily like remove it if necessary. The third is, again, like, yes, deleting data if you don't need it, right? So keeping like arbitrary data, well, one, it costs money, but like two, it's just the less you have on like about people's behaviors, the better it's going to be, because you may think like, you know what, it's fine, nothing's going to happen. But I could tell you, like, your DevOps person maybe puts a Jenkins server out in the web that you didn't really know, and someone hacks it and then is able to access that data, right? Or like, I say Jenkins because it's notoriously buggy and well, it's patched regularly, let's put it that way. So if you don't keep up, then things happen. But ultimately, like, you may even think like things are fine as far as the privacy laws, but then something nefarious could happen and someone could access all this data that you didn't think was really that important. But now you're actually in trouble because you have all of these, especially if you're a global company, you have all these agencies all across the entire world that you literally have to, each one of them, supply a package in their whatever format they want to be able to say like, okay, here's the users of this affected, or here's like the impact of this to the people that you care about. Here's the impact of this to the people you care about, right? And like, I can tell you, like, you rack up lots of lawyer fees, you rack up tons of like, all sorts of fees around getting people to come in and analyze what happened, because that's sometimes part of the reporting mechanism. So like, just you are just going to be in a better position overall if you keep as little data as possible about what people might consider sensitive, right? And if you don't, you definitely are introducing a risk profile into your company that maybe you haven't really thought about.
Martin, I know that healthcare actually has some pretty strict laws about HIPAA and different things that help make sure that our healthcare data is protected to a better extent. So you want to make sure the audience is aware of some of those?
Sure. Well, healthcare, there's a lot of different categories where you're looking at different levels of risk. And you have to be sensitive to what kind of data you're collecting and about what. So anything you collect about minors is in a different category than adults. There are certain diseases that you have to be very careful how you report. So if someone has an AIDS test, there's particular laws about how you keep that information and how you disclose that to the patient. Similarly, if you want to share information, it'll depend on the situation, what you're allowed to do, and so there's consents that your doctor asks the patient, will ask you for consents. But if you've got if you're in the emergency room and you're unconscious, there's certain data that the doctor can, break the glass, kind of like you break the glass and do a fire alarm. So that's the idea behind break the glass. So there are systems where there's data that's hidden from them, but they say, okay, I am taking responsibility as the doctor, and I'm telling you I must have this information, and then they're protected and they can do that. But if they don't break the glass, they can't get that level of information. So when we build systems in healthcare and when we build interfaces to share information between entities, we make sure to follow all those different rules. And that's why any basic healthcare agency or practice of any size will have a privacy officer that will review the practices. And before you implement any large systems, they'll go through a litany of tests to make sure, and they'll certify you that, yep, you can do this, we're okay. And so that's kind of the overview.
Those kinds of people, they have law backgrounds, or what's usually their background?
Some of them have law backgrounds, but they have backgrounds in those particular classes that you take. And like one of my business partners is an expert in that, and you're certified.
Yeah, because I find that's where like all these questions eventually go. You're like, can I do this? And then you either have to have someone that's like very, very trained on it, or you're always like talking to legal counsel. It's very expensive. Right?
Well, so you're getting experts that are internal, that are looking at your information. And there's, it's not just a matter of, yes, you're okay to do this. No, you're not okay to do that. It's really about assessing risk, right?
Right, sure.
So if you are an organization that deals with mental health and you think that that's something you want to take on, it means you're taking on a higher level of responsibility to take care of your data and data stewardship. If you're an organization that doesn't deal with mental health, but there's this one little thing that's mental health oriented, your privacy officer or your legal counsel will tell you, do you really want to take that on? It's not your core business, and you're assuming a different level of risk. So those are the kind of questions you're looking at. Healthcare is much more deliberate. There's much bigger penalties, and there's bigger penalties for data breaches, and it also really hurts your reputation. Because if you're reading that your hospital just had a big data breach, not only is it maybe going to cost them $5 million in fines and what have you, it just messes with your reputation.
I think that reputation question is really interesting because, we're all individuals talking, but when you are sort of saying we want companies to secure data and do it correctly and to use it without bias, then what's the gain for them, right? So reputation and the ability to improve sales and economic return are all important. And just as one example of where that reputation really comes to play is like in the US Census. So this last census, there was a back and forth conversation where President Trump wanted to put, so this was during his administration, wanted to put a question on about citizenship. What is your citizenship? And there was a lot of concern in the immigrant community, even for people who were here completely legally, or had become naturalized citizens, that there was something nefarious that was behind that. And I'm not going to assert whether there was or wasn't. But the outcome of that meant that even people who were born here, and I would speak to during the census because we were responsible for helping LA folks respond to it and answer the questions, would say, well, yes, but my grandmother is visiting us and she lives with us much of the year, and I don't want them to come and take her away. Or I have a friend who's here illegally and undocumented, and I don't want them to take him away. And if I answer, then there'll be a record of my address. And so our record that somebody who is Mexican or somebody who's Colombian lives here. And so you can see it in the response to the US Census is that places where there was more concern about that, there was a much lower rate of return of response. And so just, not that the question ever made it onto the census, but just the concern and the reputation of what that data would be used for affected the outcome of what's a really important instrument for a lot of things for the next 10 years. So have you, maybe one of you seen where a company's reputation either helped them to collect data? Because, we also have corporations that we love or that we're really loyal to or that we have an emotional connection to. And then there's others we don't.
So your question is, has good reputation of good data stewardship helped a company? I mean, I think, for example, Apple has touted that for some time, right? And, they've not always, they try to be ahead of it, but that's kind of a moving target, I think. And I have an Android. I'm not an Apple fanboy.
Apple.
I do have a MacBook. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, I think people really trust Apple when it comes to that, right? And this most recent Facebook thing where Apple is really digging into Facebook's ability to generate revenue is actually gaining them even more of a fan base, right? Because like a company like Facebook, who has made a lot of, I would say, they're the opposite, right? They're where people, they have not taken care of their data stewardship. And in return, their reputation has tanked, right? And so having Apple come in and say no, we're good data stewards and we are going to actually limit the ability for this bad data steward to be able to access is yeah, I think that plays into a lot to Apple's hand. But there's others for sure. But at Apple, I'd say comes as the most dominant one in mind.
That's the one that comes to mind. I think there's more negative than positive when it comes to data stewardship. I had a boss back when I worked in the entertainment industry, and we had a Christmas party, and I said, "Are we going to see you at the party?" He's like, "No, as a rule, I don't go to Christmas parties." I go, "Why?" "Well, I can't think of anyone that's been promoted because of the behavior at a Christmas party, but I know a lot of people that have hurt their careers at a Christmas party, so I don't go." So that's kind of the thing about data. It's much more you're going to hurt yourself than help yourself.
Right. So I know that all of us at DataCon work in data in some way, or hope to work with data in some way. And so I want us to explore kind of what you would say their role should be. What is it around data privacy and security? Because we're not all in cybersecurity, and data privacy and security sometimes seems like something else for somebody else on the team to do. And I think it's really important. I know that at the city of Los Angeles, we recently put in a digital code of ethics. So this is really sort of a call out to our developers and our vendors to say, we want to empower your teams to call out when something doesn't feel right. So if somebody is using data that's there's a suspected bias. Again, this doesn't mean that anyone has bad intentions. It just means that the way and the methodology or the approach might be introducing something that's biased. Either the data that's being gathered, the methodology, or the way it's being put together. We're particularly focused right now on algorithms being developed, even things like, routing traffic, right? So some things that can seem very mundane, we just want to make sure that people in the teams are empowered to say, hey, I want to ask a question about this, and that we give them that opportunity and that responsibility to do it. Because sometimes, your part in the project is so small, you just do your part, pass it on, do your part, pass it on, and it's hard to kind of understand the end results of that. So what role do you think all of us have to play in this?
I think it's difficult. I think it's unfair for me to say that, yes, everyone should speak up, right? Because look, I mean, let's say that you're willing, you want to build your data science career, right? Lots of people wanting to move into it, and so you get this job offer from a company that maybe is not always on the up and up, right? Like, but it's an opportunity for you to break into this space that maybe is like your dream job. So you're going to have these difficult things all the time, and there's some companies even in LA that like certainly are not, don't have business models that I agree with, right? So it's not exactly fair for me to say, but there are some like, I wouldn't say like it's your job to go like, I'm not working on this, this seems wrong, right? But I would say, because you guys all have to evaluate your own career paths, like, what's important to you at that time. But ultimately, there are subtle things that you can do that I think help, right? So for example, that story I told about, like, not blocking out private areas, right? Like if you were working on that project with me, right? If you had said, we probably should not record these, or at least block them out, like, my response would probably be like, yeah, you actually are probably right. Let's just go ahead and like, build that from the ground up rather than have to strap it on afterwards, right? So like, just mentioning it oftentimes gets the ball rolling and gets like better data stewardship, period, right? Other than that, like, depending upon your level in the company, yeah, it's incredibly difficult. Like, when you're actually, I would say, higher up in a company where you could actually like impact how things are done, right? So like maybe you can't necessarily impact what they want to accomplish, but ultimately you could probably impact the route they take there to be a little bit safer, right? And again, always, people don't think about it. It's like a bomb, right? So like you don't think about it until it's too late. It's already like, blown up in your face. So always try to approach it from the guise of like, look, let's say that someday they make companies audit if they have like certain data types, right? Like we want to make it easier on ourselves. So if we can't think of a use for this, or this doesn't make sense for what we're trying to do, then let's not do it, right? Just like think of the future, right? So if you just assume a future where like, and the ball's already rolling towards there, where data is becoming more and more eyes on how people use data, right? It's not out of the question to assume that there's going to be laws enacted that are going to affect the systems that you built in the past, right? And so building them with an eye towards the future, I think will overall help the company you're at.
I agree with what Parker is saying, and I won't go over the same ground, but let me add another couple little points to filter. One is, especially if you're starting out, absolutely do look at the kind of companies you want to work for, and just be really clear about like, why are you here on this earth and what are you trying to promulgate? And you may have different views than I do, or Parker or Jeanne have, but really think about, do you want to work for a company that's going to ask you to do things 2 years from now that you don't really want to do? So that's one area. The second piece, I think, okay, you're already working for this company, it's an ethical company, but you may not be comfortable with something. The requirements, the business requirements, are the things that are going to go to ethics to begin with, right? So that's not really data. But once you've got, let's say, good business requirements, there's two places where ethical practices are driven. And one is user interface, working closely with data. And often in the requirements phase, those two will be teamed up together, because you want to know what to capture, you want to know what it's going to look like for the client to look at that. So one thing to look at from the data perspective is, you should know the best practices. Yes, you want unique IDs, don't use social security numbers. That's an easy one. But there are healthy practices that you can educate yourself about. So just practice good data hygiene. And then from the user view, if you research into what dark patterns are, and there's a combination of data and UI. My brother, the free plug, my brother gives a great presentation on dark patterns, Devon from Diamond. But if you look at you just Google it, you can find plenty of information. This is how you present data that would limit the user's choices, how you present data that gives you a misleading perspective, the kind of data that you're capturing that don't need to be captured. I think that's where the ethics come in.
I'm just going to be a little controversial and say that I think that you all have the power to make the data products you work on better and more ethical. And it can be really scary at times because you may not be very high up or you may be new to an organization and you don't have to stand up in a meeting and shout down everybody. But you can go to somebody who's your mentor at that organization. You can go to somebody even at a different organization and talk about it. You can reach back to maybe one of your professors at college. Sometimes there's privacy officers or even, your supervisor to just, kind of voice what you're concerned about. Now, it may be that there's somebody else further down the line who's actually doing that check and balance, but it could be that sometimes people just don't think about it. And most people at most organizations that are the kind that you want to work for are going to want the final product to be trusted and have that good reputation for the company. So it's important to work for a company that you feel is going to ask you to do the kind of work that you are going to be proud of. And I just want to say that we are hiring 1,000 people a month for the next year at the City of Los Angeles. So come see me afterwards or email me at jeanne.holm@lacity.org. And if you're interested in working for the city and making a difference. But I think you all have the power to know what the right thing to do is, and that you'll figure out the right person to help bring in to that discussion if you're concerned about something on your projects. Because it's really up to all of us to make data science an ethical field and to make sure that as we move forward that these artificial intelligence systems and machine learning and different components are ones that really represent the best for our world. So we just have a few more minutes and I want to just let everybody say some parting thoughts. Parker?
I do have a response. So I do find that if you are senior enough, then generally yes to probably thinking about okay, this data, I'm building this model and it needs to integrate with this product and here's how it's going to look and here's how it's going to be used, right? But I find that certainly more junior people aren't always thinking about how it's going to be used, which makes that whole understanding of whether or not there's lines being crossed or potentially crossed very difficult. So yeah, I would say yes to all the people that aren't very senior here. That is one thing that you should absolutely make sure you're getting, not just for data privacy, just so that it'll help you build better products, right? Understand the context for how it's actually what's being built, why it's being built, how it's going to integrate, and what the ultimately goal you're trying to accomplish as a product, rather than just I want to get this certain accuracy on this model.
Yeah, that's really good. Just to elaborate on something Jeanne is saying, from my perspective, if you're picking the right company, you're working for a company that is going to listen to your concerns and you bring it up, it could be a really good conversation. Hey, looking at this from a data perspective, I think we're asking too much of the customer and maybe we should be doing this. It's not necessarily that someone's giving you something nefarious if you're working for the right company. If you're working for the wrong company, they're not going to listen to you and they're not going to care, and just my perspective. So choosing the right company is one where your voice can be heard.
I think there's communities that are represented here at this conference. So RMDS is a great community in the Pasadena area. DataCon, has these annual events, but they have other events too. And then we also have an organization called Data for Good here in Los Angeles, and we have monthly webinars. And so these are safe spaces to also take a little abstraction about whatever's concerning you at work, or just have colleagues who understand the intricacies to talk about. So if you're junior and you're I feel really uncomfortable speaking up at my work about this, there are others that you can kind of at least get a sense of what's happening in the community and what some of the standards and norms are. We're all here for each other. Our work is hard, and being able to do it together and kind of bounce our ideas off each other is what's going to make us really have some big changes and breakthroughs. So I'd just like to thank all of you online, all of you listening here today, and Martin and Parker for some really amazing thoughts, and I'll see you guys all online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for this great session. Just gonna ask the panel members, would you like to take one or two questions from the audience? Does anyone in the audience have maybe a question? Yes, please.
So
Sorry.
the question was about the role of GDPR and the impact it has on our work today. Parker actually been kind of.
That's a good question. Again, I am not a lawyer. The way that I would say GDPR mostly impacted me in the past, for example, would be, or my teams and the companies I work for, is less about what you can and can't do, and more about transparency and and more controls over your own data, right? So, for example, like prior to GDPR, like if someone's like, "Hey, I don't like you having this data, please remove it," right? We'd just be like, "Yeah, sorry, that's kind of like we need that for this product," right? And there would be nothing you could do, right? But now, I mean, and so like now it's like with GDPR, for example, and I'm not up to speed so much as on CCPA since it was like a working draft for a long time, and then I can't remember where, I'm not quite sure where I wound up, but ultimately with GDPR, it's like you can inspect your data. We have to be upfront about whether or not we are going to sell your data or how we're going to package your data, right? You have the right to be forgotten, which is not necessarily the same as like deleting your data. It just means like removing the links that could possibly connect you to your data, for example. Yeah, so it's a lot more control, more so than just what you can and can't do.
That just because you don't have a base in the European Union doesn't mean GDPR doesn't affect you. If you do business there or people are buying products off your site, those rules also apply to you. So kind of as we become more of an integrated online global community, the things in one country and the rules there often affect, a company that's somewhere else, but is doing business in there.
Okay, great. Quick question from a different perspective. I don't work for a big company. I work for a relatively small company, and I was the first data person that was brought in. So I'm kind of tasked with trying to figure out how to go about managing, being respecting people's data and going about this sensitively and taking the proper safeguards. So something that you mentioned, looking at a code of ethics or building our own code of ethics, or studying these laws like GDPR. Like, what should be my approach in making sure that I don't miss something? Someone who's relatively junior. Like, I don't want to make sure I'm missing something, and then we have this big hole in the future, and we look back and say, "Oh, we missed this." So, any guidance on how to approach that?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of sort of micro courses online. So thinking about looking at either case studies, like you could just sort of be like, when you think of a company kind of like yours, but that is maybe more further along, then you can go to be like, well, how did that company structure it? Did they ever publish any papers about what they did? The other thing is kind of looking at course curriculum. And we're standing here at USC, and finding those sort of micro courses I think are really good. And then I find that I'm getting a lot out of both giving and participating in webinars these days. But going to the ones that are also saying, and at the end we'll give you a toolkit, right? So the idea of being like hearing the perspective, but then at the end having like a checklist, like what the heck am I supposed to do? And then participating in these communities like RMDS and DataCon and Data for Good, like we're all there to help each other.
So also it depends what jurisdictions you wind under, right? So like if you fall under GDPR, right, then part of that law, and again, it's about transparency and control, but there's one other aspect, which is like there's processes you have to go through that are more about, do you have your stuff together in the company? Are you organized, right? Are you thinking about these things? So for example, you have to detail all the types of data you have and like certain procedures that accompany them, right? There has to be somebody that in your company that's going to be the GDPR person that, like, if there's any questions that they get sent to them, right? So these processes, like why I'm mentioning this to you is like, if you have to follow those, then that's usually a good starting point anyway to like figure out like, okay, what data do we have? Like what things might be important and what things might not be important. But it's regarding like, as your team grows, yeah, like, look, getting a good data culture is really important, and there are several ways to do it. One of the, like, I would definitely, not even just much a code of ethics, but like put together whatever you want to call it, like, bullet points about what your team is and the behaviors you expect, right? And, emphasize it regularly. That was one of the biggest shocks. Like, lots of things in, like, lots of cultural things in a team propagate automatically, right? But certain things that require, that maybe like are kind of a pain to think about, don't, right? So you have to regularly emphasize, like, okay, no, you can't copy this data to your laptop. No, you can't do this, right? Like, and rather than saying people, like, catching them and saying, no, it's better just to be upfront and like have it built into the way that you like regularly communicate with the team, so that everyone is on the same page about expectations around behavior and expectations regarding data ethics.
So I have a question coming from a company, not in my volunteer shirt. So I'm a co-founder of a company that is called Upful. We created a platform that helps coach people to be less biased, more inclusive, and we are going through the process of like SOC 2 compliance and stuff like that. So we're learning all the, the rules and regulations and everything. It seems really important to go through all the processes and to learn about what to keep and what not to keep. And one of the biggest struggles we had was not keeping all the data and learning to limit what we kept so that we could still make good informed decisions about trying to create a model that could learn but not be biased, but to detect bias and things like that. And so I was wondering what your opinions are about this sort of area of science.
Detecting bias?
Yeah,
or
well, detecting bias and creating platforms that instead of trying to avoid bias are looking for the presence of bias or the...
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting challenge. I could definitely see, I mean, you're never gonna be able to catch everything, and every data set's slightly different, but especially like, okay, so I could imagine, for example, if you want to do business with the city of LA, right? That, and let's say you have this predictive model that can really like kick ass, right? That there is some program that they're going to put you through that essentially would say like, hey, you need to check with this provider and make sure that your models aren't too biased for us, right? So I could totally see that at some point winding up being part of a process, especially working with like governmental entities or entities that, like, if it's truly important for them to be unbiased, right? Like, and they, you're not going to detect it obviously in your accuracy metrics, right? And lots of different places, but yeah, I could totally see that being a business model that's going to grow as, especially if you have data sets that no one else has, right? That help that, because for example, let's say I have a slim data set that comes from like, like an app, right? And so you want to build a multi-$100 million product off of it, right? And then you roll it out and you realize that it's really only useful for 1% of the population because the data that you have is so biased. So yes, like I could definitely see money being spent to understand early on whether this is the biased data set or not.
I think it's fascinating, and I'd love to talk to you more about it, actually. Okay, well, I'm here today. So I think part of it is companies companies that maybe have one or two data scientists, and they're struggling to like understand this, but they want to understand if there's bias. Companies also economically, if there's bias in their data, they may not be serving their products to the right customers, or maybe not developing the right products. I know, for example, one of the things we've seen is like the changing way in which we gather data about gender identity. So for example, if you looked at some of our old data at the city, you would think that there were only men and women, there were no people who were transgender, right? But that's only because we didn't have a category. We didn't allow that selection and definition of data within our data set. So it's not that something doesn't exist, it's that the way we've structured it, which we've structured differently now, but in the past, the way we've structured it either wasn't aware of that or precluded it or excluded it intentionally, whatever it was. So I think that companies economically want to understand, certainly if their bias is keeping them from making more money or serving more customers. Anything to add?
I think you got it.
I'm right here.
Thank you so much. I think that will conclude our session today. I would like to thank the audience here and on Zoom, and especially the panelist members for a great session. And hopefully this will inspire more people to come back for DataCon 2023. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're really good at this.